Hello friends. Since the series of the United States has been up and running for a bit and has been going the way I want it to, I figured it's time to bring my interest in the Cold War area of geography to the forefront. Thus today we're going to start a new series called Back in the USSR, just like the Beatles song. The Soviet Union and its allies were a large part of the geopolitical headlines throughout the 20th century. And while there's certainly no shortage of issues from that side of the world, I think folks had this tendency to forget that real, actual people lived there, just like here in the West. So I'd like to kick off a little series that delves into some different topics around the former USSR and Eastern Bloc states, and perhaps touch on some things that might have gotten the shaft over time. This won't necessarily have a consistent format like the United States episodes. Rather, these episodes will spend a significant portion time of talking about the Soviet period of some geopolitical part of the former Soviet Union, or Eastern Bloc. So welcome to the very first episode in the series of Back in the USSR. We're going to kick this off by discussing one of the most fascinating regions of the former USSR, which now falls in the modern Russian Federation, known as Tuva. More officially, it is known as the Republic of Tuva, and to get this thing going, we're going to go ahead and locate it. So Tuva, not to be confused with Tuvalu, that's in Oceania, is found within the south-central region of Siberia within Russia, bordering the northwestern parts of Mongolia. It also shares a border with 5 other Russian regions, those being Altai and Khakassia to the west, the massive Krasnoyarsk to the direct north, as well as the Irkutsk and the Buryatia to the northeast. You will find this in the basin of the Yenisei River, one of the longest in Asia, and it is surrounded by the eastern and western Shayun mountain ranges, where you'll find the mighty Mongun Taiga, the republic's highest point. Nearby sits the capital of Kizil, right where the Great and Little Yenisei River come together. Now, as you can tell by that map, almost all of Tuva is desolate and empty, with only 5 cities as well as a few small towns, and it gets extremely harsh and cold in the wintertime, with mild summers. Thus, it is very sparsely populated. The latest census I could find was from 2021, and it had a population of over 336,000 people. Ethnically, the population is mostly considered Turkic, with some diaspora in Mongolia and China, and they're an indigenous group to Siberia. However, this region is a bit of a melting pot considering the different states that controlled the region for many centuries. So how did it end up in Russia? Before the Soviets, Tuva had Turkic origins going back prior to the Mongol Empire and would eventually find itself within the Qing dynasty after the Yuan dynasty saw the end of the Mongol Empire as we know it. Sometime around the 17th century, the Tuvan people found a bit of an identity that they could build themselves around, and this was bolstered by the adoption of the Tibetan-style Yellow Hat Buddhism. With the Xinhai Revolution in the early 20th century, the Republic of China would take formation, and not long after the Russian Empire swept in and took Tuva as a protectorate, known as Uryan-Kai Krai, allowing Russians to settle the area. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they would establish this as the Tanu-Tuva People's Republic, acting as somewhat of a Soviet puppet similar to the newly independent and Soviet-backed Mongolia. By the way, the Tanu part of this refers to the Tanu-Ola Mountains. This lasted until 1944. In this time frame, the nation would adopt a Soviet-style planned economy and take efforts to nationalize the land and industry. They also set out on campaigns to boost literacy, as much of the population wasn't able to read or write. In fact, the script would go from Tibetan-Mongolian style to Latin and eventually Cyrillic. Access to healthcare and hospital was also emphasized during this transition. Something neat about this era was that it saw some of the cultural aspects of the Tuvan people come to brighter fruition. One of those would be Tuvan throat singing, which is a traditional form of musical expression called khumai. Basically, it creates multiple pitches at once due to the use of harmonics. This is actually a cultural heritage recognized by UNESCO, yet there was one complication, as the ruler, Donda Kular, sought to make Buddhism the state religion, which didn't really sit well with the Soviets. So in came a Moscow-backed coup in 1929, where Salchak Toka became the general secretary. Fast forwarding to the Second World War, after 23 years of independence, Stalin decided, never mind. And Tuva was once again re-annexed into Russia, this time into the Russian SSR, with the new given name Tuvan Autonomous Oblast, bringing in more Russian workers to further industrialize the mines and build factories. It's still somewhat disputed to this day on whether or not this was forced due to the nation's uranium deposits, or if it was voluntary and petitioned to be admitted. But it would make sense for this to be a bit of a power move by Stalin to keep China's hands off the satellites. Regardless, this brought different complications, as the Russian migrants tried to bring with them the Russian culture and language, something that was a bit of a trend across all the other Soviet republics. It also greatly worked against the nomadic and herding lifestyle that much of the Tuvan population was accustomed to for centuries, which is pretty contradictory to the agricultural collectivization that the USSR boasted. However, it did see the development of infrastructure and new industries. It just may not have sat well with everybody. Later on, however, there was a bit of a revival of the Tuvan identity when the state began preserving some of the folklore and traditions as a way to highlight the USSR's multi-ethnic nature, despite the push to integrate them into the socialist project. Unfortunately, with the decline of the Soviet state and its eventual collapse, Tuva would come out one of the poorest regions due to the lack of investment and inefficiencies within the stagnated economy of the 80s. They would absolutely struggle even worse than others with the move into the capitalist model. But let's look into some deeper details. Despite the fact that the Tuvan population did double by 1962, the Russian population grew by about 35 times, bringing the ratio to almost a third of the population. Much of this was concentrated into the capital of Kizil, and about 56% of the Supreme Soviet delegates were ethnically Tuvan. Something worth noting is that Tuva had a resource called Tuva cobalt, which was the richest source of cobalt in the entire USSR, giving the need for more mining. Livestock also played a very large role in its economy at the time, and despite collective farming, by 1950 about a quarter of it was still in private hands. The Soviet era also saw more modern means of agricultural cultivation, such as the use of plows, combines, threshers, and mowers. And finally, the rural houses would start to see some of the newer technology for the time, such as record players and sewing machines. Looking at the urban population, the area that was once all but cut off from the rest of the nation now had restaurants, cinemas, post offices, and other public services that would have otherwise been foreign to the herding population just a few decades prior. Other small cities such as Kamzira and Samagaltai began popping up. Soviet technicians would see a lot of resource extraction around gold and coal, as well as the implementation of water power to harness electricity, giving way to the construction of the Tuvan Railway. Zeroing in on Kizil, it's said that this is located in the literal exact geographical center of Asia, which gave way to a monument for this built as recently as 2014. The highest development of the city is found right at the meeting point of the Yenisei proper, which also saw a monument constructed in 1964. Much of the buildings here resemble the brutalist style that we can see all over Eastern Europe to this day, to house the populations that were previously living in yurts similar to the Mongolian style. Believe it or not, there is also an airport here that serves regular flights to Moscow, as well as other larger cities within Russia. Some important structures from the time still do remain, such as the National Museum of the Republic of Tuva. This was founded in 1929 and showcases a lot of artifacts from the region, including religious and ethnographic collections. Built shortly after the end of the Soviet period is the Tsetchen Ling Temple, which is an important Buddhist temple that has one floor for residency and another for prayer. Admission is free, and there are even classes held here sometimes. Speaking of the end of this era, Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost program saw an uptick in Tuvan nationalism, as the region had been heavily Russified in the previous decades, as I said. Right around here is where a lot of anti-Russian rioting began, and this actually played a part in the increased violent crime that we've seen since. Tuva is still the most impoverished region of Russia, and its tourism sector does see a dent thanks to the higher homicide rate. But should one like to try and make this journey, the surrounding areas includes lots of holy springs, and one might catch a glimpse of shamanistic rituals. In fact, there's an entire shaman center, and lots of monuments to different figures including the giant Arat statue, a Lenin monument next to the National Theater, and the Tuvan Institute of Humanities showcases some ancient Turkic runes and sculptures. These days, a lot of the former mentioned tensions still very much exist, with some factions of the small population looking to gain from the spoils of the Soviet days, while others long for full independence from Moscow, which likely would have been the case had it gotten its wish of being its own Soviet republic right before the dissolution. And let's be real, there's very little chance of that happening when you consider Tuva's military force stacked up against Moscow's. I think we'll cap this off. A big old thank you for sticking around. What do you think of Tuva? Do you or someone you know have any experience with it? Please let me know. Peace out, comrades.